I used to believe disaster wore obvious clothes. I thought ruin looked like a man drinking too much, gambling away savings, wrecking a marriage with one loud mistake, or getting fired in a way people whispered about for years. I thought if a man avoided the dramatic mistakes, he was probably doing all right. That belief kept me calm for a long time, and it kept me blind. My life did not fall apart all at once. It narrowed slowly in choices small enough that I could defend every one of them. I kept the steady job because steady jobs were rare. I bought the sensible house because sensible houses made people nod with approval. I drove the dependable car, stayed on the familiar road, turned down the risky offer, then the uncertain move, then the invitation that might have forced me into a room where I could look foolish. People praised that version of me. They called me reliable, mature, level-headed, the kind of man who could be counted on. Nobody warned me that approval can become a cage when the thing being praised is fear dressed up as responsibility. The first house Linda and I bought sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The ceilings were low, the carpet was beige, and the kitchen was narrow enough that two people had to turn sideways to pass each other. We could afford it, and at the time that seemed like the only question worth asking. I remember standing in the empty living room after the papers were signed, listening to my shoes click against the bare floorboards before the carpet went in. Linda talked about curtains, paint colors, maybe opening the wall someday. I looked around and felt relief. I did not understand then how dangerous relief can be when a man mistakes it for happiness. Linda saw the difference before I did. She never accused me in those first years, but sometimes I would catch her watching me while I balanced the checkbook or talked us out of a weekend away because the water heater might go next. There was tenderness in her face, but worry had started living there too. I thought she admired my caution. Now I think she was trying to understand where the rest of me had gone. She had married a man who once talked about building things, going places, trying something of his own. I told myself safety was love. Some of that was true. A roof matters, groceries matter, a paycheck matters when people depend on you. But I used those truths to bless every smaller version of myself. I did not only want stability, I wanted insulation. I wanted days I could forecast, bills I could predict, choices that would not expose me. What I called wisdom was often just fear wearing clean shoes. There was a hardware store a few miles from our house where I used to linger on Saturdays. I would pretend to compare drill bits or clamps while imagining another life. I had once wanted to build custom furniture. Tables, cabinets, shelves, pieces sturdy enough to outlast a season of someone's life. I loved the smell of sawdust and lacquer, the patience of measuring twice, the feeling of turning plain boards into something useful and beautiful. Once, Earl found me there with 2 pine boards balanced across a cart and a look on my face I could not hide. He tapped the end of one board and said good wood did not get better by being stared at. I laughed, but I put both boards back anyway. On the drive home, my palms smelled faintly of resin, and that small trace of the life I wanted stayed with me through dinner. Starting a shop sounded reckless. The mortgage was new. The car needed payments. Linda was trusting me to be steady. So I turned the dream into a harmless story I could visit in the lumber aisle. I told myself it could wait until the house was easier, until work was less busy, until courage arrived in a form that felt less like danger. Dreams are more fragile than that. They do not always die because someone laughs at them or blocks the door. Sometimes nobody stops you at all. You keep choosing the safe aisle until the door that once looked open becomes something you can barely remember. That evening, Linda found me standing in the garage, staring at a clamp I had bought years earlier and barely used. She asked what I was thinking. I said nothing important and heard how small it sounded. A man can lie with a sentence that looks harmless. The closest I came to stepping out of that smaller life began on an ordinary Tuesday after work. Earl called and asked if I could meet him near the old rail spur where the cabinet shops used to be. I almost said no, because supper was waiting and rain was gathering in the gutters. But something in his voice made me drive over anyway. He was standing under the awning of a 2-bay workspace with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. The place smelled like dust, machine oil, and old lumber. To another man, it might have looked plain. To me, it looked like a door I had spent years pretending not to see. Earl walked me through the space slowly. There was already a workbench along the back wall, a small office with one cracked window, and enough room for saws if I ever stopped treating equipment like a fantasy. He told me the owner wanted a clean tenant more than a high rent. He had even talked him down, because he knew I would start small. Earl was not pushing me into some grand gamble. He was offering a narrow opening that fit the life I already had. Even that frightened me. It was the kind of chance I always claimed I wanted. Small enough to survive, real enough to expose me. He slid a folded lease across the bench and said I did not have to sign it that day. I only had to admit whether I wanted to. That was the part I hated, because wanting sounded less defensible than worrying. Worry could wear a tie and sit upright at the table. Want stood there with sawdust on its sleeves, asking me to become visible. I kept reading the same paragraph of the lease while my eyes avoided the blank line where my name would go. At home, Linda listened while I described the place. She did not clap or rush me. She only sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug and asked what the first step would be. I said I needed to think through the numbers. She nodded, but her face changed in that small way I had learned to ignore. She knew I was not doing math. I was building a wall and calling it a plan. Before bed, she asked if I wanted her to be excited for me or quiet for me. I told her quiet would be easier, and I hated myself a little for how fast the answer came. For 3 nights, I carried a notebook from room to room. I wrote down insurance, rent, tools, lumber, taxes, and every possible reason a cautious man could stay where he was. I did not write down pride. I did not write down hunger. I did not write down the look on my face when Earl unlocked that door. Fear always wants the official record kept in practical language. It wants columns, totals, and responsible headings. It does not want the truth written in plain ink, because the truth was simple. I wanted that shop, and I was scared to be seen wanting it. By Friday, I had decided the timing was wrong. By Monday, I had nearly convinced myself Earl had been reckless to suggest it. When he called, I let it ring twice before answering, because I already hated the sound of my own excuse. I told him we should wait a little while, maybe revisit it after the holidays. Earl was quiet long enough for me to hear rain ticking against the porch roof. Then he said the lease would not wait for a man to feel ready. Another man took the space 2 weeks later. I drove past it one evening and saw lights on inside. Saw a stack of boards leaning near the open door. Saw a shape moving where I might have stood. I told myself it was fine. I told Linda it was probably for the best. She did not argue. That was worse than anger. Her silence felt like a receipt for something I had already spent and could not get back. Years later, I understood that I had not avoided failure that month. I had chosen a quieter one. I failed without witnesses, without bankruptcy, without anyone gossiping about me. That made it easy to mistake the absence of damage for a good outcome. But a dream can die cleanly and still leave a body behind. Mine did. I carried it to work every morning, and it got heavier each time I pretended my hands were not meant for anything else. After Earl's shop slipped away, I became strangely alert to people who had done what I could not. I noticed the contractor at the lumber desk who complained about customers but still laughed from the chest. I noticed the woman at the flea market selling restored chairs with chipped paint under her fingernails and a line of people waiting to ask prices. I noticed anyone who seemed tired from work they had chosen. Their lives were not easier than mine. Some of them looked worn thin, but there was a different weight in them, a weight that came from carrying something they had picked up on purpose. I wanted to call that foolishness. For a while I did. It protected me. If I could make brave people sound immature, I did not have to admit they were alive in a way I was not. Linda never used that word with me, brave, but she kept leaving small invitations where I could find them. A flyer for an evening woodworking class near my keys. A newspaper clipping about local craft fairs folded beside my lunchbox. Once she mentioned that Earl still knew the man who leased tools by the month. I heard encouragement and received it as pressure. That is what safety had done to me. It made love feel like criticism whenever love asked me to move. The year my father died, the pattern became harder to deny. My father, Rebecca's grandfather, had worked at the same plant most of his adult life. He was steady, punctual, and tired in a way our family treated as honorable. At the funeral, people praised his loyalty and his discipline. I believed those things deserved respect. But after the service, Rebecca and I helped sort through an old cedar chest in my mother's spare room, and we found a different record of him. There were brochures for a machine course in Tulsa, a map with circles around towns in Colorado, and a letter from a foreman offering him a chance to train for work that would have taken our family out of the same old county. Rebecca held the papers carefully, like they might tear if she breathed too hard. She asked if I had known about any of it. I said no, though some part of me felt as if I had known all along. The papers had the same smell as my old excuses, dry and hidden, and still waiting to be justified. One photograph had slipped between the brochures. My father was standing beside a truck I had never seen, one hand on the door, his face turned towards something outside the frame. He looked younger than I remembered, and less certain than the stories made him sound. Rebecca said he looked like a man about to leave. I wanted to correct her, but I could not. The photograph had caught him before the family version hardened around him. That night in the motel, Linda sat beside me while I turned one brochure over and over in my hands. I kept saying my father had responsibilities. Linda did not disagree. She only asked whether responsibility had explained everything or whether it had become the word he used when fear was too embarrassing to name. I wanted to defend him because defending him also defended me. Instead, I stared at the carpet and felt the family myth loosen inside my chest. I had spent years believing I was different from him because I spoke softer and made newer excuses. The shape was the same. For the first time, I saw caution not as a wall around our family, but as a story we kept handing down. We had inherited more than work ethic. We had inherited a habit of shrinking desire until it sounded childish, then praising ourselves for outgrowing it. We called staying put wisdom. We called silence strength. We called tiredness duty. The trick was that each word held some truth, which made the lie harder to see. A responsible man can still hide. A loyal man can still be afraid. A good provider can still withhold the fuller person his family needed. On the drive home, I looked at the road ahead and saw more than miles. I saw my father's papers, Earl's keys, Linda's folded clippings, and my own careful hands returning boards to shelves. The terrible part was not that I had been trapped. The terrible part was that the door had opened more than once, and I had trained myself to admire the lock. From then on, every safe explanation sounded a little less clean than it had before. The first person I nearly passed that lock to was Andrew. He was grown by then, old enough to have his own bills and his own doubts. But a father's fear can still reach across a table if he gives it the tone of advice. Andrew came over one winter evening with snow melting off his jacket and told Linda and me he was thinking about leaving the job he hated to join a small crew restoring old houses. The pay would be uneven at first. The hours would be rough. He said the work made him feel awake. I heard the same words that had once lived in me, and instead of protecting them, I attacked them. I asked about insurance, slow seasons, retirement, and whether he wanted to throw away what little security he had built. Each question sounded reasonable. He had not asked me to approve his courage, only to stop dressing my fear as protection. That difference came late to me. That was the danger. Fear does its best work in the voice of common sense. Andrew sat back and let me finish. He did not shout. He did not accuse me. He only said he had spent years watching me be safe and still look disappointed. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the furnace start in the hallway. Linda looked down at her hands, and Mara, who had stopped by with groceries, pretended to sort cans on the counter. Nobody rescued me from the truth. I wanted to tell Andrew he did not understand sacrifice, but I knew he understood more than I wanted him to. Children study the lives of their parents before they know they are studying. They learn what words cost, what silence buys, and what kind of adult a house rewards. Andrew took the restoration job. I did not approve at first, not honestly. I said I hoped it worked out, but my voice carried the old warning. Over the next months, he sent pictures from job sites. Peeling stair rails sanded smooth, old doors rehung, a porch brought back from rot. His hands looked rougher, his face looked lighter. He complained about bad weather and late checks, but the complaints had life in them. He sounded like a man inside his own days. Mara noticed it too. One Sunday after lunch, she helped Linda clear the plates while Andrew showed Joel a photograph of a ceiling beam he had repaired. Joel asked why anyone would fix an old house instead of buying a new one. Andrew said some things are worth saving if you get to them before the damage spreads too far. I felt that sentence move through the room and land where nobody pointed. Linda did not look at me, which somehow made it sharper. Later, Mara joined me on the porch while the others talked inside. She was gentle, but she was never careless with truth. She said Andrew had been scared to tell me because he thought I would turn his hope into a court case. I wanted to argue about tone, about respect, about how fathers worry because they love. Mara let me have a few sentences, then said, "Love that only knows how to warn can start to sound like a locked door." I thought about that after they left, while rinsing plates in water gone almost cold. Linda dried beside me without saying much. The kitchen window reflected the two of us back like strangers doing a familiar job. I saw how often she had stood near me while I defended fear in the language of care. I saw how many times my children had brought me a living question and received a safety inspection instead of a father. That was the shame I had not expected. Playing it safe had made me feel innocent, but innocence ended when I saw the caution spreading through my own house. I had thought my regret belonged to me alone, private and contained, but it had been teaching lessons in every room where I had chosen fear out loud. I did apologize to Andrew, but late and awkwardly. We were standing in his driveway beside a stack of salvage trim, and I told him I had mistaken my fear for guidance. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Forgiveness came, but it did not erase what he had already learned from me. That is one of the costs people leave out. When you spend years shrinking from life, you may later choose courage, but the people you love still remember the man who taught them caution first. By the time Linda got sick, our marriage had become tender in its habits and tired in its deeper places. We still knew how to care for each other. I set out her coffee mug at night because mornings were hard on her hands. She reminded me which shirts could not go in the dryer, even after decades of watching me forget. We moved around each other with the ease of people who had shared a house for a long time. But ease is not always closeness. Sometimes it is only the smooth path, worn around everything two people have stopped saying. The diagnosis arrived in early spring, with gray light pressing against the hospital windows and rain darkening the parking lot. I will not reduce Linda to her illness. She was more than waiting rooms, pill bottles, and the careful way nurses pronounced our last name. But sickness strips decoration from a life. It makes the old excuses sound thin. A man can hide from himself in ordinary weather. It is harder under fluorescent lights, while the person who loved him longest is trying not to show pain. One evening after treatment, we sat in the car before driving home. The engine was off, and rain tapped the windshield in soft, uneven bursts. Linda was tired in a way that made every other kind of tired seem almost theatrical. She looked toward the concrete wall ahead of us and asked whether I had ever been happy, or whether I had mostly been relieved. The question did not feel cruel. That made it worse. It felt accurate. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel and saw a whole life arranged around the easing of fear. Relief when the payment cleared. Relief when I did not have to choose. Relief when an opportunity passed and could no longer ask anything of me. I had called those moments peace because peace sounded nobler than escape. I told Linda I thought I had done what a husband was supposed to do. She said she knew that, and there was no anger in her voice. Then she said she had sometimes missed the man who wanted things. Not the younger man exactly, and not some reckless stranger, but the part of me that used to lean forward when he talked. She said she had spent years watching me protect our life so carefully that I stopped fully entering it. I saw then that devotion without openness can become another form of absence, polite enough to pass for love. That was the sentence I had avoided for years. I had no defense worth speaking. All my better language had always belonged to caution. I could explain insurance, mortgage rates, bad timing, and practical limits. I could not explain why the woman beside me had spent so many years sitting next to a man who kept hiding his hunger from her. I reached for her hand, and she let me take it. That mercy nearly broke me. For once, I did not try to tidy the moment with a practical answer. I sat there with the damage I had helped make. In the months that followed, Mar and Andrew came often. Joel drew pictures at the kitchen table and taped one to the refrigerator. A crooked little house with smoke coming from the chimney, and all of us standing outside under a yellow sun. Linda smiled at it for a long time. After everyone left, she said children draw people outside because they think families are supposed to be seen together. I knew what she was really saying. We had been visible as a household. We had not always been visible to each other. Rebecca came one afternoon with soup and stayed to help Linda sort old photographs. I heard them laughing softly in the dining room, and for a minute the house sounded almost young. Then I saw the pictures spread across the table, trips postponed, birthdays I had rushed through, summers where my body was present and my mind was already back at work. After Linda slept, I sat under the range light with her grocery list on the table. Basil, soup, batteries, ordinary life still making its small requests. The safe life had not stopped loss. It had only made me face it with too much unlived truth still in the room. I finally understood that I had been guarding the walls while the rooms inside went dim. Linda had wanted a life with windows open, not a museum of paid bills and avoided storms. I had kept us sheltered, but too often I had also kept us still. After Linda died, people praised me for holding together. They meant it kindly.
The rest of the house
At
was
the
dark.
funeral home,
I
I
could
shook
smell the rain
hands,
coming into the
accepted
old window
casseroles,
frame. On the
thanked
table
neighbors,
sat a pile
and
of
stood in the
unopened
dark
mail,
suit
a
that never
grocery
fit
receipt,
right across the
and a
shoulders.
notepad where Linda had written
People
basil,
said I was
soup,
strong.
batteries,
Maybe part
ordinary
of me
life
was,
still making its little
but
requests.
part of me was
I
only
remember thinking how
performing the
obscene
same
it
old
was that a
skill
man could
that had
spend
shaped my
decades
life for
preserving
decades.
stability only to
I
discover
could
stability
contain,
was never the
manage,
same as
steady my
presence.
voice,
Playing it
keep the
safe
frame
had not
from
saved
shaking.
what I loved most.
The
It
world
had simply
rewards
delayed the
that,
honest
especially in
reckoning
older
until the
men.
margin for repair grew
It
painfully
does not
thin.
always ask what the
They meant
steadiness
well.
has cost.
I know that. At the funeral
When
home,
the
I
house
shook hands,
emptied that night,
accepted
the
casseroles,
quiet felt less
thanked
like
people for kind
silence
words,
and more
and
like the
stood through all the
removal of one
rituals
note
expected
that
of a
had
man
held
who has
all
lost
the
his
other
wife
sounds
after a long
together.
illness. I wore the
The
dark
clock
suit
in
that
the
never
hall,
fit quite right
the
in the
baseboard
shoulders.
ticking,
I said the
the
correct
refrigerator
things. I kept
motor,
my voice level.
the wind
There
moving
are
against
social
the
rewards
windows.
for behaving steadily in public
Everything
grief.
was still there.
People call it
Yet
strength.
the house had
Sometimes
become
it is.
unfamiliar.
Sometimes it is
I
only
stood
the
in the
oldest reflex
garage
in a
and found the
person's body
clamp Linda had
continuing to
once
do
seen
what
me
it has
staring
always
at.
done.
It was still
Contain,
hanging from the
manage,
same
keep the
nail.
frame from shaking.
I
When the
touched
house
it
emptied
and
out
felt
that night,
foolish
the
for
quiet
how
hit
much
like
grief
weather.
can gather around
Not
a simple
silence,
tool.
exactly. More like the
A
removal
few
of
weeks
one vital
later,
note that had made all
Mara
the smaller
found a
sounds
folder
feel
in
part of a
Linda's
world.
desk.
The baseboard ticked.
Inside
The
were
clock in the
clippings
hall.
about
The
woodworking
ice maker dropping
classes,
cubes into the
a
tray.
note with
I
Earl's
stood in the
number
doorway to our
written
bedroom with my
twice,
tie loosened
and a
and
brochure
understood.
for a
Finally,
weekend
and without
market
any
where
protective
local
wording,
makers
that
sold
safety had
furniture
not
and
preserved me
small
from
household
devastation. It had
pieces.
simply robbed me of the fuller
Linda
life I
had
could have
not
shared
kept those
before
things to
devastation
shame
came
me.
anyway. That is
I
the part
believe she
people do
kept
not say
them
out
because
loud.
some loyal
Loss
part
does
of
not
her
ask
still
whether you played it
expected me to
safe.
wake up.
Illness does not check
The
whether you
faith
were
in that
prudent.
folder hurt
Time
more
does
than
not
anger
spare the
would have.
cautious. All the
I
self-denial
called
I had
Earl the next
mistaken for
morning
wise
before I
living
could
did
talk
not buy
myself out of
exemption
it.
from heartbreak.
My
It
voice
only
sounded old
guaranteed
to
that I
me.
arrived at
I
heartbreak
told
with more
him I did
unlived
not
life
know what
behind
I
me
was
than I could
asking
bear to
for.
count. In the months
Only
that
that I was
followed, I found
tired of
evidence
being the
everywhere
kind
of
of
what had been
man who
waiting for
waited
my
until
participation.
everything became
Brochures tucked in
symbolic.
cookbooks, a clipping about a
Earl
mountain
did
train
not
route,
make a
a community
speech.
college course
He
catalog
told
with
me
a
to
corner
come by
folded down
after
on
lunch
woodworking
and
classes.
wear clothes I
Linda
could
had
ruin.
kept these things not to taunt me.
That was the
think,
closest thing
but
to
because part of
grace
her
I
believed
knew
the
how
man
to
she
accept.
loved might still wake up before the
His
window
workshop
closed.
smelled
That
like
faith in me was a
pine,
gift.
coffee,
I did
and
not
metal
honor it while she was
filings.
alive. So what
The
did
first
playing
thing
it
he
safe
gave
cost
me was not a proud
more than one
project,
dream,
but a
more
broken
than
drawer
one
box
business I
from an
never
old
started,
dresser.
or one move I never made.
He showed me how
It
to
cost me a
square
deeper
it,
current that might
clamp
have
it,
run through my
sand
marriage.
the edges,
Cost me
and
private
stop
respect.
rushing the part
It nearly
nobody would
cost me the
see.
example I set for my
My
son.
hands were
It
clumsy.
cost me years of
My
feeling
back
my own
hurt.
life from the inside
I made
instead of
mistakes a
monitoring
younger
it from a
man
guarded
would have
distance.
corrected
And in the
faster.
end, it cost me the comfort of
Still,
innocence.
when the drawer
Because
finally
once I
slid
understood
clean,
the pattern,
I felt
could no
something
longer pretend
open
my
that
life
had
had
been
simply
closed
happened
for
to
so
me.
long.
I have done
I had
braver
mistaken
things in
the
the years
closure
since.
for character.
Small things, mostly.
I
Driven
wish
farther
Linda
than I
had
planned.
seen it.
Taken classes
But
with
I
men young
also
enough to
know
call
wishing
me sir.
cannot
Built
stand in
tables in a
for
rented
choosing.
workspace that smelled like pine,
Still,
coffee, and
it
dust.
changed the room.
Sat alone in unfamiliar towns.
I did
with
not become a
nobody there to
great
confirm my
craftsman.
identity except
That's
the
not the
choices I was
point.
making. None of it gives me
I
Linda
built
back.
a side table
None of
for
it
Mara,
refunds the
a
lost
shelf
years.
for Andrew,
But each act
a rough
teaches
little
the same hard
toolbox for
truth.
Joel,
Risk
and a
was
small
never the enemy
cedar
I made
box
it into.
Rebecca said she
Fear
wanted
was.
for old
Safe
family
was never
photographs.
neutral. It was steering.
None of it paid
Now, when
back
evening
the
falls,
years.
I sit on the back steps
None
and
of it
watch the light
returned
flatten
Linda
over
to
the
the
neighboring
kitchen
roofs.
chair or
Somewhere
put
a
us in the
dog
car
barks,
for trips
then
we
another
never
answers.
took.
The train sounds
Late
faint from across
courage is
town.
not a
The air
refund.
smells like cut
It
grass
is
or
only
cold dirt,
proof
depending
that
on
the
the
lock
season.
was never
I
as
am an old
strong
man
as I
now,
made it.
and I do not have enough years
The
left
first
to
table
worship
I
comfort
finished
the way I
rocked
once did.
slightly on
If
the
there
shop
is
floor.
anything worth saying plain,
Earl
it
told
is
me
this.
not to fix it too
The life you
fast.
protect too carefully.
He said a man
becomes the
ought to
life you
study
never
where
fully
he is
enter.
uneven
I learned that
before he
late.
starts cutting
Late
things
is still
down.
better than never. But not
I knew
by
he
much.
was talking
Mara
about
once
the
ran her hand
table,
over one of those
but
tables
not
and
only
said
the
Linda would have
table.
liked the feel of it.
I brought it
That
home
sentence
anyway
nearly
and
knocked
set
the
it
breath
by
out
the
of me.
window where
Not
Linda
because it
used
was
to
cruel,
read.
but because it was
For
generous.
weeks, I
She was
kept
giving me a
touching
way
the
to keep
edge as
loving
I
her mother
passed.
through motion
Not proud
instead of regret.
exactly, but
Andrew
awake.
helped me carry the table into the house.
Joel asked
And
why
Joel
I
crawled
smiled at a
underneath it to
table
inspect the
that did
joints
not
like a
sit
foreman.
perfectly
The rented
level.
workspace was not heroic.
I told
The floor
him
sloped
because
near
I
the
had
back wall.
finally made
The coffee maker
something
burned
real
everything
enough
afternoon.
to be
One window
uneven.
rattled when trucks passed on the street.
Now I
Still,
understand what
the
playing it
first
safe
morning I
cost
unlocked
me.
that door,
It
I
cost
stood there
me
longer
more
than
than
I
a
needed
business
to,
or a
smelling
dream.
pine, dust,
It cost
and
me
old
the habit
concrete.
of meeting my
Nothing
own
about
life
the room
honestly.
rescued the years.
It cost
It only
Linda
proved that
years with
choosing
a
was still
husband who was
possible,
present in
even
duty
late.
but guarded
When Mara
in
touched the
spirit.
table later, when
It
Andrew
nearly
helped
taught
carry
my
it,
children to
when Joel
confuse
crawled
fear
underneath
with
to inspect
wisdom.
the joints,
It
the
left
choice
me with grief
finally
sharpened
had
by the
witnesses
knowledge that loss comes even to the cautious. If I could speak to the man I was, I would not tell him to be reckless. I would tell him safety is not neutral. Every safe choice still chooses something. I learned that late. Late is better than never, but not by much.